Some people eat China's food, but smash China's pot. This kind of behavior is really a traitor to the country and damages the national interest. Unfortunately, such people will exist in any era. If traitors are just ordinary people, then they may be less harmful to the country. But if the traitors are officials, then their harm is even greater. Because their actions may lead to serious losses of national interests. Today I want to introduce to you Fang Fuming, who once served as the director of Zhejiang Electric Power Bureau. As an important official of the country, in order to seek his own self-interest, he is willing to act as a lackey of the United States and Japan, and leak more than 500 confidential documents of our country without authorization, causing our country's losses to reach tens of billions. Hateful. What's even more heinous is that Fang Fuming not only betrayed the country himself, but also connived at many cotters to fall into trouble with him and collude with him to do evil. If Fang Fuming's used computer had not exposed his evil deeds, perhaps no one would have known about it until now. What deserves our deep thinking is why a senior cotter with such a prominent official position and rich income would sell his country for glory. What exactly did Fang Fuming do on the computer? How will he be punished? In 2000, the National Security Bureau took a sudden action and arrested Fang Fuming on suspicion of espionage. A large number of confidential documents and evidence of his collusion with U.S. intelligence agencies were found in his computer, and the number of people involved was as high as 35. As soon as the news came out, everyone was shocked. No one expected that the enemy had penetrated into us so deeply. No one would have imagined that such an iron rice bowl that many people dream of, if they don't take good care of it, why would they do such a rebellious thing? Why bother? Why bother? Things happen for a reason. In 1936, Fang Fuming was born in a peasant family in Zhejiang, and his family was very poor. However, he has outstanding grades and was admitted to Shanghai Jiaotong University majoring in mechanical and electrical engineering with excellent grades. After graduation, he was successfully assigned to work in the Electric Power Bureau and successfully jumped out of the farm. He is indeed a smart and hard-working person. He was promoted from an ordinary engineer all the way to the deputy director of the Electric Power Bureau. Born in a peasant family, he is used to hard work. Unlike others, perhaps because he was afraid of poverty when he was a child, his desire for money was stronger. As the scale of the projects he was responsible for became larger and larger, his inner balance began to unbalance, and he had the idea of corruption. In the end, he completely indulged his greed by chance. In 1985, when Fang Fuming was in charge of bidding for the Bailunport power plant, a Japanese company called Marubeni approached him and offered him a kickback of $160,000 as long as he helped secretly manipulate the winning bid. You know, eating and taking cards is expressly prohibited by the Electric Power Bureau. Even now, $160,000 is not a small amount, converted into millions of RMB. What's more, it was an era when 10,000 households were very scarce. Faced with such a huge temptation, Fang Fuming couldn't control himself and embarked on a road of no return. After Fang Fuming received millions of bribes from Japanese companies, he completely betrayed his motherland and became a lackey of Japan. Later, he colluded with Japanese companies and was even targeted by Japanese intelligence personnel. No matter what the secret is, as long as the money is in place, Fang Fuming can obtain it through relationships. He quit his job in 1989, immigrated to the United States with his family, and applied for naturalization. Even in the United States, he did not stop and continued to betray our country's secrets. As his former subordinates have been promoted one after another, they have also become his channel for obtaining secret documents. He then took these classified documents to trade with the United States and Japan. Prosperous and prosperous, he soon became the chairman of an electric power company, but the National Security Agency eventually set his sights on him. As long as Fang Fuming participated in the bidding projects, he could win all the bids, and investigators found that he had close contacts with U.S. officials, so he became the focus of the investigation. Despite this, Fang Fuming was very cautious and acted without leaving any traces, and the investigators did not find any clues. Until 2002, a staff member discovered the hotel where Fang Fuming had stayed before by coincidence. When they checked the computer that Fang Fuming had used, they found a lot of clues. The data in this computer is very rich, including the locations of power grid lines and power plants across the country, as well as highly confidential information such as records of transactions with the United States. Everyone present was shocked. After Fang Fuming was arrested, he denied all the crimes he had committed, and even declared arrogantly, "I am an American. You have no right to kill me." The reason why he became a US citizen was to prefigure that if he was exposed one day, he could use his US identity to evade guilt. However, his thinking is too naive. The crimes committed in China cannot be easily erased. In the face of conclusive evidence, he finally admitted his crimes as a US and Japanese spy for many years, and implicated 35 other public officials. Shockingly, he also revealed the crimes of Cha Keming, the Vice Minister of the Ministry of Power Industry of our country. Cha Keming had helped Japanese companies bid 4 times and accepted more than $60,000 in bribes, becoming the #1 criminal in this case. In the end, Cha Keming was sentenced to 12 years in prison for accepting bribes. After Fang Fuming, the central figure in this case, was found guilty of economic espionage, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. After serving his sentence, he was deported. At present, the scale of local debt and the solvency of local governments have been paid more and more attention. Local debts include local general debts, special purpose debts, and various hidden debts including urban investment debts. The scale of local debts is still controversial, but the growth is rapid. Institutional investors, including banks, insurance companies, funds, etc., are the main holders of local government bonds, and they are generally worried about the hidden risks of local government debt such as urban investment debt and non-standard bonds. For example, the Development Research Center of the Guizhou provincial government recently pointed out that debt reduction work is extremely difficult and cannot be effectively resolved by relying on one's own ability alone. This article puts forward 4 dialectical thoughts on the current local debt issue that everyone is concerned about. The scale of local debt is too large, and the scale of central government debt is too low. Since the implementation of the tax-sharing fiscal system in 1994, the revenue certainty of the central government has increased, and the pressure on local fiscal revenues and expenditures has generally increased. Especially in the past 3 years of the epidemic, it is common for local governments to make ends meet. 10 years ago, there were many discussions in academic circles about the mismatch of financial power and administrative power between the central and local governments. The general view was to either increase the financial power of the local government or reduce the administrative power assumed by the local government. However, as the real estate industry entered a prosperous stage after 2000, the land transfer fee income of local governments increased steadily, and the pressure on their fiscal expenditures was not great. The local government really began to feel the debt pressure after 2010, because the economic growth continued to decline after 2010. In the economic growth model dominated by real estate investment, the enthusiasm of local governments for land development, infrastructure investment, and the expansion of local construction scale is unprecedentedly high, which makes land finance creatively derive a set of credit-based models that support local governments. Economic development. However, there is no one profit model that can be done once and for all. The negative growth of China's population and the slowdown of urbanization in 2022 all indicate that real estate has entered a downward cycle. Correspondingly, the downward cycle of population and real estate means that land finance will be difficult to continue. In 2022, the land transfer fee revenue of local governments will drop by nearly 2 trillion yuan compared with the previous year. In 2022, the income from the transfer of local state-owned land use rights will decline. Image source, China Government Network, Zongda Securities Research Institute. In 2015, local government special bonds began to be issued, and local debt has grown rapidly since then. Special bonds are generally repaid through corresponding special income or government funds. However, due to the rapid growth of special purpose bonds, the growth of land transfer fee income has been far behind the growth of special purpose bonds, resulting in a substantial increase in the balance of local debt. Since 2015, the national local debt has continued to expand. Image source, WIND, Zongda Securities Research Institute. For example, by the end of 2022, the national general debt balance will be 14.39 trillion yuan, and the special debt balance will be 20.67 trillion yuan, totaling about 35 trillion yuan, an increase of 55% and 276% respectively compared to 2015. Since 2019, the year-on-year growth rate has remained above 15%, which is about 3 times the actual GDP growth rate. Obviously, this debt growth model has exceeded the tolerance of local governments. Therefore, the rapid growth of local debt is bound to be restrained in the future. That is to say, the intensity of the counter-cyclical fiscal policy may be reduced, which means that it is unlikely to introduce a large-scale stimulus policy in the future, and the economic growth rate will be closer to the potential growth rate without stimulus. But even so, how to deal with local debt is still an unavoidable hurdle. Therefore, in the context of shrinking land finances, the mismatch between financial and administrative powers of local governments has come to the fore. International comparisons have found that in most countries, the debt structure of the central government far exceeds that of the local government in the debt structure of the government. Country comparison of government leverage ratio. Image source, WIND, Zongta Securities Research Institute. From the figure above, we can see that the leverage ratio of the Chinese government is around 100%, which is not high. Compared with 145% in the United States, Japan's 260% is significantly lower, and it is also lower than Italy, Canada, France, and the United Kingdom. However, China's local debt, including invisible local debt, accounts for as much as 74% of GDP, which should be the highest in the world. The United States is only 28.8%, Japan is 36.6%, Germany is 20.9%, and France is 9.4%. At the same time, compared with the leverage ratio of the central government of major economies, China is almost the lowest. On the other hand, the leverage ratio of local governments is the highest in China. It can be seen that under the premise that the leverage ratio of the Chinese government is not high, the leverage ratio of local governments in my country is indeed high enough. Need to adjust the proportional relationship between central and local debt balance. That is to say, in the future, the scale of bond issuance by the central government should be increased to reduce the burden on the local economy. Urban investment bonds need to maintain government credit and cannot easily default. Urban investment bonds refer to corporate bonds and medium-term notes publicly issued by urban investment enterprises. In accordance with the new budget law and the number 43 document that clearly decouples urban investment bonds from local government credit, the positioning of urban investment companies has changed from a local government investment and financing institution to a market-oriented operating entity, and local governments will no longer cover urban investment bonds. But in fact, the market still regards urban investment bonds as high-credit bonds backed by local governments. Therefore, urban investment companies are usually investment and financing institutions under the local government, and it is difficult for them to become completely independent and purely market-oriented enterprises that have nothing to do with the government. Chengdu's debts mainly include borrowing from banks and issuing bonds for financing. The former is the main method, but the scale of the latter debt financing is not small. By the end of 2022, the balance is estimated to be more than 13 trillion yuan. Overall, since 2011, the national urban investment interest-bearing debt has expanded rapidly, with an annual growth rate of more than 10%. By the end of 2022, the national urban investment interest-bearing debt will be 54.1 trillion yuan, compared with 6.4 trillion yuan in 2011. Yuan has increased by more than 7 times. The growth of the balance of bonds issued by Chengdu platform. Image source, WIND, Zongta Securities Research Institute. Therefore, urban investment platforms have actually become the main form of local debt, and the scale is significantly larger than the sum of general debt and special debt of local governments. Among the urban investment platforms, the bond balance of the urban investment platform is about 13.8 trillion yuan, and there has been no default case so far, indicating that urban investment bonds are still high-grade credit bonds endorsed by local governments. However, non-standard defaults on urban investment platforms occur from time to time, and bank loans are extended and repayment methods are often adjusted. At present, the market is generally worried about the growth of local government debt and the decline in the growth rate of fiscal revenue or even negative growth. Especially for the northeast and central and western provinces with weak financial resources, the yield of urban investment bonds is generally higher than that of the developed eastern provinces and cities. In 2022, 13 provinces' land transfer fees will cover less than 100% of government debt interest, only 5 in 2021. After Henan's Yangmei bond defaulted, it had a negative impact on the credit bond market in Henan province and even the whole country. The credit stratification phenomenon intensified, and some economically weak areas were marginalized. For example, financing costs in Qinghai, Yunnan, and Tianjin are still rising in recent years, Financing costs in Heilongjiang and Guizhou have risen sharply from 2017 to 2019. Although financing costs have declined since 2020, the overall decline is smaller than that of the whole country. In Liaoning, Guangxi, Jilin, Chongqing, Shaanxi, Ningxia, and Gansu, the decline in the weighted average coupon rate of urban investment bonds since 2020 is also significantly lower than that of the whole country. Against the backdrop of a weaker than expected economic recovery, investors' appetite for risk has dropped significantly. To this end, local governments should ensure that urban investment bonds are paid on time. This is because breach of contract will not only fail to solve the debt problem, but will worsen the regional credit environment, making it difficult and expensive for local state-owned enterprises to obtain financing. From the perspective of future regional economic development, government departments still need to continue to borrow to achieve stable economic growth, and they need to maintain government credit and cannot easily default. Therefore, there is an urgent need to enhance the confidence of Chengdu creditors, first of all, to ensure that Chengdu bonds do not default, which means that Chengdu can borrow new ones at low cost to repay old ones. The central government proposes that whose family's children should be held by the family, which means that local debts are not covered, but it is suggested to give a certain amount of underpinning support to difficult provinces, that is, to support local governments in policy to debt reduction, such as helping local governments the government, such as the borrowing of new urban investment companies to repay the old, reduces the cost of debt and lengthens the maturity of debt, non-bond. Debt extension, such as the extension of bank loans in Zunyi Daoqiao practice, and reduces the cost of debt through low-interest funds from policy banks or commercial banks. The cost of debt makes it easier to roll over debt. In addition, we also hope that the central government will give policy support to whether local governments can sell state-owned assets to repay debts. Because on March 1 this year, the State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission stated in its reply to the proposal No. 00503 of the 5th session of the 13th National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference that it will issue institutional regulations and operational rules in due course to explore effective ways and means to standardize the withdrawal of state-owned equity shares, give full play to the advantages of limited partnerships, and help state-owned enterprises innovate and develop. Obtain income from the transfer of state-owned enterprise equity to repay debts. A typical case is Mutai Chemical Bonds. In December 2019 and December 2020, Mutai Group announced twice that it would transfer a total of 100 million shares of listed companies for free, accounting for the total share capital of Queiqiao Mutai, 8%. According to the current market price, the market value is about 160 billion yuan, to Guizhou state-owned assets. At the current critical stage of China's economic transformation, it is particularly important to maintain the credit of local governments and prevent regional financial risks. Therefore, the faith of urban investment bonds still needs to be maintained before urban investment companies are completely decoupled from government departments. High-quality development, the central government needs to continue to increase leverage and invest in startup funds. From an international comparison, my country's macro leverage ratio is indeed not low. According to the statistics of the National Finance and Development Laboratory, it will be 263.8% in 2021, which is close to the average level of developed countries. Leverage ratio of major global economies, percent, 2021. Image source, Wind, Zongda Securities Research Institute. Why is my country's macro leverage ratio higher than that of developing countries? The reason is that the Chinese economy had a long period of delay before 1978, leading to today's getting old before getting rich, while Japan, South Korea, and other Western developed economies, they all developed after the end of World War II or the Korean War. Smoothly, realizing get rich before you get old. In 2022, my country's total population will experience negative growth, and it will also enter the stage of accelerated aging, that is, the rate of aging will be faster than that of developed countries. Therefore, in order to develop into a modern and powerful country, we must increase investment, which requires a further increase in the macro leverage ratio. However, compared with Western countries, the leverage ratio of my country's corporate sector is obviously too high, reaching 154%, including debts such as urban investment companies, so there is not much room for further leverage. Leverage ratio of various sectors in China, National Balance Sheet Research Center calibration. Image source, Wind, Zongda Securities Research Institute. In 2021, the leverage ratio of the residential sector will reach 62%, which is basically close to that of developed countries. Moreover, due to the low proportion of my country's residents' disposable income in GDP, for example, in the first quarter of 2022, the debt balance of China's household sector/disposable income was 141.8%, and the proportion of disposable income used to repay debt and interest was 15.7%. Higher than developed countries such as the United States, Britain, Germany, France, and Japan. The debt repayment pressure of my country's household sector is significantly higher than that of other countries. Image source, Wind, Zongta Securities Research Institute. It is precisely because the debt repayment pressure of the resident sector is too great, so since 2022, the growth rate of long-term loans to residents has dropped significantly, and resident deposits have risen sharply, the so-called excess deposits, which will increase by nearly 8 trillion yuan in 2022, which can actually be regarded as the shrinking balance sheet of the resident sector. Similarly, the investment of private enterprises in my country has shown extremely low growth in recent years, which also means that the private sector is shrinking its balance sheet. According to McKinsey estimates, China's total social net assets soared from about 7 trillion US dollars in 2000 to 120 trillion US dollars in 2020, more than 17 times that of 20 years ago. Over the same period, the US only more than doubled to $90 trillion. The rapid growth of my country's assets is inseparable from the great expansion of real estate and infrastructure investment. In the future, with the possibility of shrinking balance sheets in the corporate and residential sectors, my country may face the pressure of shrinking assets. Therefore, only the government sector still has room to increase leverage in the future. After all, from an international comparison, the Y-caliber leverage ratio of my country's government departments is not high. Moreover, my country's system is significantly different from Western countries such as Europe, America, and Japan. That is, state-owned assets account for a very high proportion of total social assets, and the total assets of state-owned enterprises alone exceed 300 trillion yuan. In addition, most of the land, forests, minerals, water resources, etc. are state-owned. If all countries use the total value of state-owned assets as the denominator of the leverage ratio of the government sector, China's leverage ratio will be much lower than that of Western countries. As mentioned above, from an international comparison of the macro leverage ratio structure, the leverage ratio of my country's government departments is obviously low. The impetus for China's economic growth in the future will come more from the borrowing of government departments, especially from the increase in the leverage ratio of the central government. Since the role of the government in future economic growth will be more important, the government can also play a positive role in optimizing China's economic structure and high-quality growth. Under the current background of weakening expectations, it is especially necessary for the central government to invest in start-up funds to drive an overall economic recovery and expansion of residents' consumption to ensure the smooth flow of the dual cycle. Promoting investment and consumption, government spending can be tilted towards promotional fees at this stage. It is expected that the global economy will enter a stage of high volatility and low growth in the future, and the growth rate of exports will also decline accordingly. Therefore, the importance of expanding domestic demand is unquestionable, and domestic demand includes consumption and investment. From the perspective of the debt structure of local governments in my country, the proportion of general debt is very small, only a little over 14 trillion yuan, while the scale of special debt plus urban investment platform debt exceeds 80 trillion yuan, and the latter is mainly used for infrastructure investment. But as the scale of infrastructure increases, its marginal effect also decreases. For example, the median return on invested capital, ROIC, of Chengdu's platform will drop from 3.1% in 2011 to 1.3% in 2021. There has been controversy about whether there is an advanced issue of infrastructure investment. However, the advanced infrastructure in certain fields is quite obvious. For example, the sales volume of passenger cars in my country has ranked first in the world. Correspondingly, my country continues to increase the total mileage of roads. At present, the number of automobiles in China exceeds 300 million, and it also surpasses the United States to become the world's number one. Therefore, it is also reasonable that the total mileage of highways exceeds that of the United States. But the question is, how much more is appropriate? Judging from the data in 2020, the number of cars per capita in my country is 1,422, while that in the United States is 1,830. Obviously, there are fewer cars running on my country's highways than in the United States, which also means that more highways may be repaired. The total mileage of expressways in my country ranks first in the world. Image source, Wind, Zongta Securities Research Institute. If we further compare Japan and other countries, we find that the number of cars corresponding to each kilometer of expressways in Japan has reached more than 7,000. Therefore, should my country build fewer new expressways in the future? Take Gizu Expressway as an example. By the end of 2022, the total expressway mileage in Gizu has reached 8,331 kilometers. Japan, the third largest economy in the world, has a total expressway mileage of only 7,800 kilometers. However, Gizu's total GDP in 2022 is less than 1/15 of Japan's. At present, Gizu is already facing severe debt pressure, and it is obvious that it can no longer borrow heavily for infrastructure construction. As far as the whole country is concerned, it is also facing the pressure of shrinking demand and weakening expectations. Therefore, in terms of expanding fiscal expenditure through debt, it should be problem-oriented, aiming at improving quality and efficiency, and optimizing the expenditure structure. For example, when the multiplier effect of spending on infrastructure investment, assuming a multiplier of 1.5, is significantly lower than that of spending on promoting consumption, assuming a multiplier of 3, can the spending on promoting consumption exceed that on infrastructure? Investment expenditure? It is generally estimated that if 100 billion yuan of consumer coupons are issued, about 300 billion yuan of consumption can be generated. If the central government issues consumer vouchers to low and middle income families, which account for 60% of my country's population, it will not only drive investment through consumption, but also drive employment through investment and change and strengthen expectations. In April, private investment showed negative growth, and the unemployment rate among young people also exceeded 20%. If we follow the Central Economic Work Conference's requirement of putting the recovery and expansion of consumption first, we need to increase residents' income through multiple channels, such as issuing consumer vouchers. Only by increasing the payment of basic pensions for ordinary people and reducing the worries of consumers can the contribution of consumption to GDP be increased.